Why do you overthink? Why does your mind replay conversations at night? Repeat mistakes from years ago. And imagine the worst possible future. Carl Jung believed overthinking is not intelligence. It's unresolved emotion. It's your mind trying to solve what your soul refuses to face. Most people think they overthink because they are deep. But Jung would say something different. You overthink because something in you is afraid. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of failing. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of losing control. So the mind becomes a prison. It creates scenarios. It creates arguments. It creates endless, what-if, questions. And the more you try to think your way out, the more trapped you become. Because thinking is not the cure. Awareness is. Jung believed that the unconscious mind sends messages. And overthinking is one of them. It's a signal that there is a conflict inside you. A split between what you truly feel and what you allow yourself to admit. So instead of asking, how do I stop thinking? Jung would ask, what am I refusing to feel? And once you understand that, your overthinking stops feeling like a curse. It becomes a clue. Let's break it down. Jung suggested that overthinking is often a form of fear. Not always obvious fear, but hidden fear. Because when a person feels uncertain inside, the mind tries to create certainty. It tries to predict everything. It tries to control everything. It tries to prepare for every possible outcome. That is what overthinking really is. A desperate attempt to feel safe. If you grew up in an environment where emotions were ignored, where mistakes were punished, or where you felt judged, your mind learns a survival strategy. Think more. Analyze more. Don't get caught off guard. So overthinking becomes protection. But Jung would point out the problem. The mind cannot control life. Life is unpredictable. So the more you try to think your way into certainty, the more anxious you become. Because you are trying to solve a problem that has no final solution. That is why overthinking creates exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Mental exhaustion. You become tired from inside. And Jung would say, this happens when the conscious mind refuses to accept uncertainty. It refuses to accept vulnerability. So it keeps producing thoughts like a machine. But beneath all those thoughts, there is a feeling that has not been faced. Fear. Shame. Insecurity. Pain. Overthinking is not the real problem. Overthinking is the symptom. The real issue is the inner conflict. A part of you wants to move forward. But another part is afraid. And until that fear is made conscious, your mind will keep looping. Jung believed that many of our thoughts are not random. They are signals. Especially the thoughts that return again and again. If your mind keeps replaying the same conversation, the same mistake, the same fear, Jung would say, something unconscious is trying to become conscious. Because the unconscious doesn't speak in clear sentences. It speaks through symbols, emotions, and repetition. So when a thought keeps returning, it's not always because you enjoy thinking about it. It's because your psyche is trying to show you something. For example, if you constantly replay embarrassing moments, it may reflect unresolved shame. If you keep imagining worst-case scenarios, it may reflect a fear of losing control. If you keep analyzing other people's opinions, it may reflect a deep need for approval. In Jung's view, the conscious mind wants to move on quickly. It says, forget it. It's over. But the unconscious says, no. Look again. Learn. Heal. This is why suppression doesn't work. If you try to force yourself not to think, the mind often becomes louder. Because the problem is not the thought. The problem is what the thought is pointing toward. Jung also believed that when emotions are not processed, they become mental loops. The mind keeps repeating, not because it is wise, but because it is unresolved. And the longer something stays unresolved, the more power it gains over your attention. That is why overthinking feels like being trapped. You're not trapped in reality. You're trapped in unfinished inner material. So Jung's path is not to fight the mind, but to understand what it wants. The moment you understand the real emotion underneath, the thought starts to lose energy. And that's the turning point. Overthinking decreases when inner truth is faced. Jung believed that overthinking often increases when you are not living as your true self. Because when you wear a mask too often, you start monitoring yourself constantly. You watch how you speak, how you look, how you react, how you are perceived. This mask is what Jung called the persona. The persona is the social identity you build to fit into the world. It helps you survive. But it has a cost. When you live through the persona, you start fearing mistakes. Because mistakes threaten the mask. And when the mask becomes your identity, every conversation becomes risky. Every message becomes stressful. Every silence becomes something to interpret. So the mind begins to overthink. Not because you are weak, but because you are protecting an image. At the same time, Jung believed that whatever you hide inside yourself becomes the shadow. The shadow contains the emotions and traits you rejected. Anger, jealousy, neediness, fear, desire. When these emotions are not accepted, they don't disappear. They become tension. And tension creates mental noise. This is why overthinking often gets worse at night. Because during the day, you can distract yourself. But at night, the persona becomes quiet. And the shadow begins to speak. Your mind replays the day. It looks for danger. It looks for mistakes. This is not random anxiety. It is your inner world demanding attention. So Jung's insight is clear. Overthinking is not just mental. It is psychological. It is the mind reacting to an inner split. A split between the face you show and the emotions you hide. And the more you hide, the more you think. Because you can't silence the shadow with logic. You can only calm it with honesty. So how do you stop overthinking? Jung would not tell you to think positive. He would tell you to become conscious. Because in Jung's psychology, healing begins when you stop running from what is inside you. The first step is honesty. Ask yourself a serious question. What emotion is hiding underneath my thoughts? Is it fear? Is it shame? Is it anger? Is it loneliness? Overthinking becomes weaker when you name the feeling. Because what stays unnamed stays powerful. The second step is to stop treating uncertainty like danger. Overthinking often comes from the belief. If I think enough, I can control the future. But Jung would say the opposite. Trying to control everything is a refusal to live. Life always contains uncertainty. So instead of chasing certainty, train yourself to tolerate the unknown. That tolerance is strength. The third step is integration. Jung believed the goal is not to kill parts of yourself, but to integrate them. If you suppress anger, it turns into anxiety. If you suppress fear, it turns into mental loops. If you suppress vulnerability, it turns into overanalysis. So Jung's path is to bring the shadow into awareness. Not by judging yourself, but by observing yourself. Practical method. Write down what your mind repeats. Then write. What am I afraid would happen if this thought was true? Example. If I fail, they will judge me. Then ask. Why does judgment feel dangerous to me? This is how you go deeper. And when you go deeper, The mind becomes quiet, because it finally feels heard. The final step is action. Overthinking is a lot of mental energy with no direction. So you convert the energy into movement. One decision. One task. One step. Because the mind stops spiraling when the soul is moving. Carl Jung believed that the mind is not your enemy. Even your anxiety, even your overthinking, is trying to protect you. It is not there to destroy you. It is there to signal something unresolved inside you. So the goal is not to fight your thoughts. The goal is to understand why they exist. Because once you understand the root, the spiral weakens. In Jung's view, overthinking is often the price of living too far from your inner truth. When you ignore your emotions, the mind becomes louder. When you betray your nature, the mind becomes restless. When you hide behind a persona, the mind becomes anxious. So the real cure is not more thinking. It is more self-awareness. More honesty. More integration. Jung's deeper lesson is this. The psyche wants wholeness. It wants you to become complete. And overthinking is sometimes the unconscious pushing you toward that wholeness. It is a message that something needs attention. A boundary that needs to be set. A truth that needs to be admitted. A wound that needs healing. A decision that needs courage. So if you overthink, don't shame yourself. Instead, become curious. Ask. What is my mind trying to protect me from? What feeling am I avoiding? What part of myself am I rejecting? Because the moment you stop running, the mind begins to settle. And slowly, the thoughts that once controlled you start to dissolve. Not because you forced them away, but because you finally listened. And that is the Jungian path. Not escaping the mind, but returning to yourself.